Hello everyone, I'm Mariam Faruqi, South Asia Regional Director at iProbono, and I'm very pleased to welcome you and our panelists to today's webinar, which provides a platform for a South Asian perspective on migrant workers' rights during this pandemic. As a former immigration lawyer and grandchild of partition, I'm mindful that the term migrant is loaded. It's a term which perhaps cannot be defined, and I'm not going to try to do that here. The ILO estimates that of the 164 million people in the world categorized as migrant workers, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan and Nepal each send up to 71,000 people overseas on average to work every year. Today's conversation will span labour migration and the failures of governments of countries of origin and of destination to take effective measures to protect citizens and non-citizens. During this conversation, I'd like us to keep in mind the complexity and varied dynamic experiences of the men and women we'll be talking about. Over the past few weeks, images of men being hosed down with disinfectant on roadsides in India or crammed into trucks as they tried to make their way home across state borders fill our screens and newspapers. The photograph of a man working at Saudi Aramco dressed as a walking hand sanitizer went viral on social media, and we're told of stories of domestic workers trapped in abusive households. These humiliations and rights violations are nothing new or particular to COVID lockdown. Our panel of 6 experts, who I'll be introducing you to shortly, bring together a vast regional experience, from the courtroom, research, policy, all the way through to grassroots activism. This moment of COVID lockdown has certainly shifted global concerns to the plight of migrant workers, but it's also served to highlight systemic, pre-existing and dismal failures in governance and basic protection in host countries and countries of origin, whether in the provision of access to healthcare, housing, sanitation, education, or even skills training for migrant workers and their families. While we've not managed to cover every jurisdiction in South Asia during this conversation due to limitations of time and space, we hope that this discussion will only be one of many to come. The aim is to ensure improved regional cooperation across sectors, to ensure collective efforts for adequate protection, and raise collective concerns for the right of many to return home. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with iProbono, we are an organisation with a vision to make justice available to all. Over the past 10 years, our mission has been to advance equality and a just society. We believe that lawyers are rights protectors and that at their best represent the needs of marginalised people. Our work on labour rights extends across jurisdictions in South Asia and the UK. I'm also so pleased to now introduce our fantastic panel, who've agreed on short notice to join us despite their busy schedules. Haris Khalique, joining us from Islamabad, is the Secretary General of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, an independent body established in 1987. I wanted to mention that Haris is a poet and recipient of the President's Pride of Performance Award. He brings with him over 25 years of experience of the civil society sector and has led campaigns on labour rights. He will be speaking to us about the current scenario in Pakistan and efforts taken to support nationals working abroad. Next up will be Barun, Ghimire, a litigating lawyer leading the Law and Policy Forum for Social Justice's work on protecting the rights of Nepali migrant workers abroad. Barun is also iProbono's Nepal legal analyst, and he joins us today from Kathmandu. His conversation is set against a background of legal breakthroughs from a human rights perspective for Nepali workers. He's also going to be talking about their increased vulnerability in destination countries during COVID, and he's going to raise the important questions of the government's legal obligations on the one hand, in tandem with diplomatic efforts of course, and contrast this with their capacity in real terms on the other. Mustafa Qadri is the founder and executive director of Equidem Research, which specializes in research advice and training on human rights and labour rights. Mustafa joins us from London, but his work spans South Asia, Southeast Asia and East Africa. He'll be talking to us about some of the experiences of discrimination faced by the workers in the Gulf. Equidem's unique research model relies on direct testimony I'm going to quote him here, sorry Mustafa, that no matter how well thought out, no strategy that protects human rights can be effective unless you first understand the reality for migrant workers. He also pointed out to me this week that in our fractured region, labour migration is in fact a unifying factor for individuals and for communities. Then moving across to Bangladesh, we have Arpeeta Mizan, an assistant professor of law at the University of Dhaka and iProbono's legal analyst in Bangladesh. Arpeeta provides a perspective on shifts in perception towards returning workers during COVID. Those who were once bearers of livelihoods through their remittances are now stigmatized as bearers of disease. She also brings a gender perspective with a focus on key issues faced by women migrant workers. And now across to India. Only yesterday we were reading about the government finally subsidizing migrants to travel home by bus. The experience of inter- and intrastate migration for work raises varied issues, and I'm really pleased that our panelist, Dr. Gautam Bhan, reminded me earlier this week that mobility is a given in today's world. We have all and always will live multi-local lives. Gautam's joining us from Delhi, but he's a senior lead in academics and research at the India Institute for Human Settlements in Bangalore. His work spans the politics of urban poverty and inequality, urban planning, housing, identity, and social practice. Gautam's going to talk to us today about social protection in this context and gaps that have always existed in the lives of migrant workers in India. And last, but certainly not least, I'm pleased to welcome Aman, a human rights lawyer based in Guwahati. Aman's part of the wider iProbono family and is tirelessly advocating on behalf of vulnerable minority communities. He'll be speaking to us today about his current experiences coordinating relief efforts for migrant workers from Assam stranded across different parts of India. So I've taken up enough of your time, but just a little bit of housekeeping before we move on to the main discussion. Most of you are by now familiar with Zoom. Each of our panelists will speak to you for about 5 minutes, and to ensure that this is an interactive discussion, we aim to save at least 20 to 25 minutes at the end for a question and answer session, which I will be moderating. Some of you have already kindly shared questions with us, and I will aim to include these in the discussion as well. There is a question and answer box on the top right of your screen. Please use this to type in your questions, include your name and organization where relevant, and name of the panelist if you want to direct your question to someone in particular. Please do keep your questions brief and to the point. For any other issues, you can communicate with our team through the chat box. Many thanks to all of you, and without much ado, we're going to travel across cyberspace to Haris in Pakistan.
Illustrious lawyers and professionals, researchers and academics. I'm just, a an ordinary human rights defender from Pakistan, and I'll be very candid because, this is our own community, and I think unless we understand that, the kind of the challenges that we face, it will never be easy to seek solutions and collective solutions or individually in our own countries. Very quickly, we have left. When I say we, I don't want to include myself, but as living in Pakistan, the Pakistani government has completely left migrant workers on their own. In fact, what we are doing is people who are put up in hotels or have been transported back through the national airlines have been charged 3 times as much the airfare to be brought back, and without even taking any precautions in the aircraft. And we know that how these infections otherwise also work in the aerosol. So there were no protections taken. 3 times of the airfare was charged for those who are brought back. Millions are still stranded because Pakistan has about 8.8 million people living, of Pakistani origin living in the diaspora. The North American and the European diaspora contribute very little to the remittances that we have, unlike what we think, and unlike, and and contrary to the political clout that they enjoy by supporting certain political parties. But in fact, the major source of our remittances, which has gone down from $22 billion per year to 17 billion this year, and will further go down, and that amounts to about 8% compared. I mean, it's not a part of the GDP, but it's about 8 to 10% of the size of our GDP, which is $341 billion. So it is actually quite sizable. So these remittances will also stop, which will have a direct impact on the economy coming from the Middle East at a macro level. But these people, I mean, people who are stranded in the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar. I mean, these are the 4 places, followed by Kuwait and some Muscat and Oman. I mean, there are very large Pakistani migrant workers in these places, and half of them will eventually. I mean, that's an estimate, of course. I mean, I do not have a scientific sort of data available to support that. But, if you look at if you monitor the newspapers, the Sharq al-Awsat, for instance, has just said yesterday that about, 40% of the workforce, the governments, the Saudi government has allowed the employers to retrench 40% of the workforce if they cannot afford to keep them, besides cutting down their salaries. So these people will get affected, and majorly affected, and they're going to return. Now, what we are going to face now here in Pakistan is that they are better skilled. I mean, the plumbers, the fixers, the turners, the carpenters, the mechanics, and other skilled or semi-skilled labor. They're going to return to Pakistan, and they're going to actually push out the local workers who are already, I mean, internally also. I mean, the in-migration is another issue, which I would like to touch upon a little later. But so these people are going to push them out. Many of them will remain unemployed, but since they are better skilled and bring in better experience, and they are more efficient, I mean, or considered, at least that has been the perception. But that's also partly true, because the better skilled actually migrate. So these people will push out the locally employed people, and that will mean that particularly Lahore and Karachi are going to be hit the worst, because you won't. I mean, yeah. 1 minute? Okay. So very quickly, I mean, coming to the, the in-migration has also been a problem. I mean, there's been a study where, they did use, some fairly sophisticated sampling techniques. And according to these studies, 26% of women workforce in Pakistan over the last 6 to 8 weeks has already been unemployed due to COVID-19. We were not doing any, and nothing was hunky-dory even before COVID-19. We were actually going through a very tough, almost reaching an economic meltdown. So these COVID-19 has compounded the issue, and the government, I mean, and I'm being really, not being sort of taking an exaggerated view, but the government has decided, and the state has actually now decided. Today they are meeting, and they have decided to let people decide on their own, and there are no support mechanisms or social safety nets being provided to migrant workers. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Haris, and I'm very sorry to have to stop you. We've sort of saved 5 minutes, which I know is not enough. So everybody keep your questions for Haris on the Q&A button, and I'm going to swiftly request Barun to provide his perspective from Nepal. Thank you, Barun.
Thank you, Mariam, for having me in the panel. And to start with, the situation of migrant workers in Nepal is not very different from what we hear about Pakistan. So Nepali migrant worker, more than 4 million Nepali migrant workers are working abroad, and 90% of them are concentrated in GCC countries and Malaysia. And these countries are not well known for their human rights commitments that we all know. And particularly with Nepali migrant workers, 70% of migrant workers work as low-skilled workers. So that adds to their vulnerability in general situation. Further, the contribution of Nepali migrant worker on GDP is equivalent to 26%, so they have significant contribution in the GDP. And considering that even in post-COVID situation, in pre-pandemic situation, the human rights situation of Nepali migrant worker was very, very alarming. So there was like human rights concern of Nepali migrant worker in GCC countries. There were cases regarding the death of migrant workers. Nepali migrant workers were abused on basis of labor rights. There were human rights abuses. So there was prevalent human rights abuses of Nepali migrant worker even before the pandemic. So that was the situation. And because of that, like the organization I was involved with, we started litigating the cases of migrant workers to ensure that they're better protected, at least at home, because migrant workers were being exploited at home as well as in destination countries. So we started doing strategic litigation to protect their basic rights. So for instance, we did case on due diligence obligation of Nepal in respect to protect the rights of migrant worker. We did case regarding the death of migrant worker in destination country, because for last 10 years, every 2 days, 3 Nepali migrant workers are dying. So when we talk about migrant workers, it's not just the pandemic that has brought a new issue for us. The human rights issues of migrant worker has always been there. And particularly from country like Nepal, the issue we have is human rights obligation, the legal obligation, which is very clearly quoted in national law, international law, and the enabling legislation. That is very clear. On the other hand, it's the competence and capacity of the state to what level country can commit to that, translate that commitment into practice. So what we have seen in Nepal is, okay, there's a constitutional commitment to protect rights of migrant worker and to make migration process safe, orderly, and dignified. But we have not seen it in like last 10 years. And what this pandemic has done is made the situation even worse. So particularly, we can categorize this issue into 2 parts. So for the migrant workers who want to come back home, government of Nepal does not have a solid plan. They've just started to discuss whether or not it is feasible to bring back migrant worker in terms of priority. So right to return is very questionable, and recognizing that migrant workers in GCC countries have started a campaign to pressurize the government. At this point of time where they should be worried about their well-being, they're trying to organize a campaign to pressurize government. That clearly shows like how serious government is regarding this issue. So right to return is one aspect of it. The second is regarding the rights of the migrant workers. They'll be staying in the destination country itself. So the migrant workers would be vulnerable in destination country because of their working and living condition. That is there as well. So the third context, or the third crucial point, is how is government of Nepal going to handle this situation and balance the rights of migrant worker to come back home and ensure the public safety as well. So there's a contradiction and conflict between the legal obligation of what should be done and the competence of government on what it can do. So that has created this environment of tension, and migrant workers are concerned. So all government of Nepal has done so far is the head of our prime minister have called like each head of the state in GCC countries and asked them to keep Nepali migrant workers safe as much as possible. And second, minister have assured that they'll come up with a plan in 2 months. So the point I'm trying to like bring forth in this discussion is migrant workers issue for last 10 years, particularly for South Asian migrant workers, has been very concerning. We have seen like mass scale of human rights violations. There have been like significant labor right concerns, and there have also been moments from different civil society organizations in this regard. And particularly with this pandemic situation, we are under time pressure and urgency to address this issue. So we're posed in a situation where we'll have to handle this situation really soon that we have not been able to handle in the last couple of years. So we're present. So this is like unprecedented challenge in terms of human rights as well, considering like the capacity of state, resources of state. So yes.
Thank you, Barun. Did I frighten you with the timing? But I think you've raised the really important issue of the fact that all these problems, the human rights violations, they existed before, and this emergency moment has sort of panicked everyone into action. So I think it's appropriate that we now move on to Mustafa, who's going to talk to us a little bit about GCC countries and his experiences over there. So thanks, Mustafa. Over to you.
Thanks, Mariam, and also thank you to iProbono for arranging today's call, and also just to say, really looking forward to hearing from all the other panelists and the panelists who have already spoken. I've already learned a lot from hearing from you, and I think also I get a lot of energy despite the depression I think we're all feeling with these really terrible times from all of us coming together today. It shows that there is the unity there of purpose and an awareness of what we need to do. So I think the first thing to say is, so I'll focus on the situation for South Asian migrant workers in the Gulf. Already other speakers have mentioned that what the coronavirus pandemic has done has really ripped off the clothes on what is basically a really unequal situation. And one thing to really stress at the outset is it's not just about human rights violations, although that's at the core of it, but this is actually also a business model that actually money is being made by basically charging workers and exploiting people who are desperate for work in societies that basically are where they are already marginalized, where there is a struggle to find them employment and a decent standard of living. And so that means that there is very little pressure both in their country of origin in South Asia and in the country of destination in the Gulf to really address the human rights concerns. And what's happened with Corona, what we're seeing with our teams in the Gulf, is that workers are either, most workers, millions of workers, mostly men, but also women, are stuck in camps, stuck in homes without pay. Or if they're fortunate enough, so to speak, to work, they're in a situation of getting reduced pay, overwork, and really, often very poor conditions. I mean, there are exceptions to that. There are certain enterprises, there are certain governments that have done things which are reasonably good. But overall speaking, the situation is really dire. And so, Mariam, as you mentioned before about the discrimination aspect, the setup is an inherently discriminatory one. And like we've seen in many parts of the world, that with the financial impact of Corona, the governments of the world have aligned very much to help the richest and the most powerful first. The idea being that you help those people, and then of course, then it trickles down to the rest of us. So what that means for most workers is when we've spoken to workers and when surveys have been done recently in different Gulf countries, and they ask workers about what's your greatest concern right now, the fear of infection is actually number two. Typically, it's the number one concern is where is my next paycheck going to come from? What we're seeing is that when the coronavirus first hit, Gulf states and employers panicked, and where they could, they just basically forcibly returned people back to their home country. There's a lot of cases that came out where workers were literally just rounded up, put on a plane, and returned home. Workers, as Haris and Barun also mentioned, when they were returned home, you had this absolutely scandalous situation where they were actually being charged money for the human right to be basically protected, the right to life, the right to freedom of movement, to go back to their country of origin. They were actually being charged for that. So these are people who are already marginalized. Because of that marginalization, they get charged fees to come to work in the Gulf. On their way back, they're again exploited because it's seen as an opportunity to get money out of them. What we've seen in South Asia, and also we work in East Africa, is that also workers are facing incredible stigma. And like you said, Mariam, it's similar to the HIV type sort of stigma that used to, or perhaps still exists. And so workers have had a really bad experience in their own country. And that really compounds the situation, because when you look at the Gulf, we're talking about the first instinct of governments has been to lock down workers, make sure that they are away from the rest of the population and treat them as basically some sort of a threat. And at the same time, what we see is that the entire economy and society is dependent on these workers. So there's a very weird disconnect there. A couple of things just to really end on is firstly to say that, despite the differences and the challenges politically between the different South Asian countries, there is a commonality there in terms of the situations that workers face. Now, we know what the problems are. We have to think about what are some of the solutions. Obviously, number one has to be creating awareness of what the nationals of the countries that we come from, what they're facing. But I think also there's a political aspect to it. And the political aspect to it is we have to give more democratic voice to workers who are overseas. There have to be campaigns to make sure that workers overseas can vote in elections, to make them politically relevant. We have to put pressure on governments to make sure that their embassies and consular officials are adequately resourced. And we also have to find ways to make it financially damaging. There's a loss to be made by violating workers' rights. And to put that another way, there are studies that have been done that show that workers that have their rights respected are better trained and are able to stay within the labor market, say in the Gulf. They get paid more, and by definition, that means they're sending back more money. So I think these, very quickly, these are the sorts of things that we have to think about. It's very dire, but there are solutions. They're not easy, but there are things that we can do. We have to unite as a South Asian people to promote those ideas.
Thanks, Mustafa. And again, I mean, from the discussion we had earlier this week as well, you've raised the issues of economics as well as a democratic and political voice for the migrant workers, which I'd really like to pick up on in the discussion when we can. So thank you. Swiftly moving from the Middle East over to Bangladesh, Arpeeta, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. And it is indeed wonderful to be part of such a great discussion. So to quickly give you a perspective of the situation in Bangladesh. Bangladesh has around 150,000 migrant workers exclusively in the Gulf region, and that excludes the overwhelming amount of people who are working in the southern European areas, including Italy. And I speak of Italy because when the COVID situation set in, Italy was the hardest hit country. And because a lot of Bangladeshi people work in Rome and Florence, the returning migrants from Italy were the first signs of the crisis that was soon to sweep through Bangladesh. So I will be talking in broadly three points. The first is I will be talking about the gender perspective. Then I will talk about the stigma. And finally, I'll talk about a very recent development in the judicial area concerning the returning migrant workers in Bangladesh. To begin with the gender perspective, unfortunately, the migrant worker, this group itself has not been in the forefront of discussion in Bangladesh. The majority of attention has been given to the opening of the ready-made garments sector, given that this is the, one of the largest areas that boost the GDP of Bangladesh. And as such, most of the focus has been gone into protecting the rights of the garment workers as opposed to the rights of the returning migrant workers. So the migrant workers as of this moment are not the group that are receiving the highest level of attention. Having said that, very few organizations are actually focusing a lot of attention to the rights of the returning migrant workers, including RAMRU, who are generally known to work on the migrant issues in Bangladesh. RAMRU has collaborated with the United Nations Women, and they have been working on relief distribution and crowdfunding sources for giving other sorts of grocery and food support to the returning migrant workers in the community level. The government has not done that much in terms of this. All the returning migrant workers have received a cash amount of 5,000 Bangladeshi taka, which would be equivalent to 4,500 Indian rupees on arrival. And the government has announced that if a returning migrant worker dies as a result of corona situation, they will be receiving 3 lakh taka compensation. However, the hardest part about the women has been the domestic violence in Bangladesh, which affects both the non-returning migrant workers, as well as the non-migrant worker female population of Bangladesh. Quickly moving on to the stigma, this also set in the very early stage of the returnee influx in Bangladesh. So I will talk about the stigma from two approaches. One is the top-down and the other one is the bottom-up. So to talk about the top-down approach, the government officials in the early days showed quite a bit of lax attitude in terms of explaining what has been happening around the world in terms of COVID. And the result has been the people have not been able to fully comprehend why staying home is necessary or why quarantine is necessary. As a result, what we have seen is, although upon arrival in Dhaka, the people have been given very brief instructions that, you know, you have to go to your home and then you have to stay indoors for 14 days. Please do not go out, and that's it. Why should I stay home? Why can I not go and meet my friends and neighbors who maybe I haven't seen for last 5 years? These have not been explained. So these people, upon returning, they actually did not maintain the quarantine for 14 days. There have been a lot of news in the media showing that these people are going to the bazaar, they're having get-togethers with their friends and families, and that actually led to the first level of community transmission in the rural areas of Bangladesh. Thank you, Mariam, for the time. Because the focus was on the returning migrant workers, the migrant workers have been considered as one of the responsible groups for the corona breakout in Bangladesh, which is absolutely not true. We have to look at how the government failed to make the instructions comprehensible to the people. So that brings me to the last point, which is the writ petition. It was filed last month in the Supreme Court of Bangladesh. So a Supreme Court advocate filed a writ petition against the Ministry of Civil Aviation and Tourism, as well as the Ministry of Home and Family Affairs in Bangladesh, asking for directives in two segments. The first is that the flights coming from Europe and other Gulf countries bearing the returning migrant workers should be regulated, and there should be a very expanding supervision to ensure that these people are actually settled in their homes and maintaining quarantines. And about the Home and Family Affairs, where the Cabinet Ministry has actually directed all the district commissioners throughout the 64 districts in Bangladesh to ensure that the proper quarantine and staying home activities are being followed. But overall, the situation is quite dire, and I agree with Haris and especially Mustafa in talking about the democratic voices. Migrant workers really do not have that much of voice in Bangladesh. And when we talk about authoritarian approach, when we do not take into account that when the lockdown and homestay, these are very new terms for the people of Bangladesh. So it was absolutely necessary to break it down in manners that people will understand why these are necessary, which has not been done. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arpeeta, and for introducing such varied experiences. I think what I'm getting from this panel is, there's so much to talk about, and we're not going to be able to do it justice here. And I'd really like us to pick up these issues. We've also got a lot of questions coming through, and I do feel that this is going to link into some other conversations. But from Bangladesh over to India, Gautam, I'll now request you to join us. Thanks.
Sure. So welcome to everyone. So I'll do something a little bit different. I'm going to focus not on the international migration of non-citizen residents, but actually to talk about citizen migrants. So talk about interstate and intrastate migration. So the word migrant in India is more largely colloquially refers more to people who go from one state to the other, or from one district to the other in the other state, right? So Bihar to Bangalore, or rural Karnataka to Bangalore, in those two ways. So, and I think that one of the things that is very critical when we think about the idea of the migrant when they are citizens, so in-country migration, is that I think this moment has made two things very clear to us. One is, I think we have to remember that the fractures we're seeing on the delivery of social protection to the state are not fractures caused by COVID, and they're not fractures caused by the lockdown. They're actually the general state of the fractures in our social protection systems. They were there last June, and they are there this June. So there is a particular degree difference in their extremity, but there certainly is not a difference in kind. I haven't seen anything that to me suggests that COVID has caused a rupture in social protection, which means that this is actually an opportunity for us really to ask the question of why is it that even in normal time, we have never had adequate safety nets for all workers. And there are times in which separating the migrant worker from other informal workers is useful. And there are times, actually, I think that the general condition of access to universal social protection should be our rallying cry without a specific focus on the migrant outside. Because remember that the category of the migrant is as much a political category that has long actually been used as an excuse for the state not to deliver social protection. Migrants are both invisible and hypervisible at the same time, because they also are useful figures to always define the limit of the state's jurisdiction. India and its political history has always created the idea of an outsider at different scales, because someone has to be an outsider so that you can define who belongs. Right? Without the migrant, there is no citizen. So I think in many ways, we have to think about the constantly changing political definitions of who is considered to be a migrant at this point. And what COVID has done is it created a really interesting, almost schizophrenic language of, at one time, a hyper attention on the question of migration, which we've never been able to gather in normal time at all. But at the same time, that attention is coming with very strong practice-based limitations on, even if you want to give benefits to migrant workers, how do you do it? When none of the institutions to deliver those benefits, from cash transfer bank accounts to data, to spatial locations, to knowledge of where people are, none of those legal arrangements of food distribution act that covers migrant workers that have ration cards in one place but work in another place, none of those institutional arrangements for delivery have been put in. So the point I want to make in my opening is to say that we must actually pay as much attention to the delivery mechanisms and institutional experiments that we need to create in this moment, because merely arguing for the entitlements and rights of migrant workers without any system to actually meaningfully deliver those rights is actually going to be a very incomplete moment. Those rights and entitlements are pivotal. But I think that many of our movements, of which I consider myself a part, we have long done much better in demanding entitlements than really done the work of saying, how should these entitlements be delivered? And I want to put three propositions in front of you very quickly. One is, migrant is not just a demographic category. In the way in which our society works, it is actually right now very much an economic category, which means that migrants are caught in value and supply chains of very different kinds. And the migrant worker who comes to a construction site with a contractor and lives on that site is very different from a domestic worker who moves across states and often intermarries intergenerationally, right? So I think we have to be much more specific about the way migrants enter specific value chains, because that's what's defining a certain kind of economic exclusion and impact. There isn't a generic category of that interstate migrant. The second, I think that the migrant is very much a category, a governmental category. And at this point, you enter into the very difficult world of ID cards, contracts, bank accounts, the formal way in which the state finds a beneficiary. I'm using this word beneficiary particularly. It's politically uncomfortable, but it is the language of state practice. And so if we want to think about how we get state social protection benefits to migrants, we have to think about systems of beneficiary identification and delivery. The last, I think, is that the migrant is also an urban category that is telling us a lot about our cities. Remember, for a lot of migrants, when we think about the choice of whether they want to invest in rural or urban, they're not just looking at opportunities to earn income. They're also looking at where they have the ability to live low cash, low transaction lives. The urban may give you opportunities for wealth accumulation, but what it requires in everyday life is you're constantly spending small amounts of cash all the time for everything, for rent, for housing, for transport. The rural economy is structured differently. And in India, our social safety net is actually rural. It is Narega that gives you employment guarantee. There is no equivalent in the urban. So this moment also has to help us to understand the distinction between urban and rural safety nets. So I'll stop there, but I think that it's important for us to really unpack this category of the migrant, see where it is more useful to bring it together with larger questions of universal social protection, but see when we need to be specific about someone being a migrant. And that's when the delivery system question comes up, not quite when the entitlement system comes up. Thanks.
Thanks, Gautam, and thanks for adding that important category. In fact, we had a question coming in about interstate migration, and people were quite keen to hear about that. And in fact, that's something I'd like to do in the discussion, is unpack the category and really get your opinions on the sort of systems that need to be put in place. So staying in India, over to Aman, who's sitting in Guwahati right now. Thanks, Aman.
Thank you. I think Gautam explained the India scenario very well. I would just like to break it down. I mean, I have seen, you know, in Guwahati, the place where I stay, there are a lot of migrant laborers around, and I have seen how they are struggling you know, they're literally starving actually. And I think there are some story tells the entire story of India, because this is how exactly what is happening all over the country. In Assam, generally people, the migrant laborers, they comes to Guwahati, which is the biggest city in the northeast, and to Jorhat, they goes to Meghalaya in the nearby distance, and they goes to all over the country. Actually, you have in Meghalaya, in Karnataka, in Kerala, Karnataka, Delhi, everywhere, West Bengal, Maharashtra, everywhere you will have migrant laborer from Assam. Now, as you know, that the lockdown was announced, you know, only 4 hours time was given. So most of the people were stranded wherever they were. But in Assam, because the lockdown started a little earlier, some people could go actually to home in a different district of Assam. There were some people who succeeded in going to their respective homes. But those who stayed back, they immediately, you know, within 2-3 days, they started starving. They had nothing to eat, and because everything was shut down, they couldn't work. So and in the urban areas, I have seen that the government did not do much to feed them. So they were basically on charity. People who went back to their place, at home there was respite, because they have the ration card there, and many people, large number of people, have land, so they at least have the rice to feed themselves. But only rice, I mean, because most of people have land, they have rice, but no other thing. The ration card, through ration card, the government is providing rice and pulses, nothing else. So they're also, I mean, you know, mostly on charity. Otherwise, through ration card, they are not getting much. And people who are stranded outside Assam, you know, basically through social media and all, we get information. We try to help them by crowdfunding or through local NGOs. But in some places, I have seen the district administration, particularly I would like to name Gurgaon, Gurugram, Noida, some district of Tamil Nadu. The district magistrate were very, very helpful. I was surprised the way, you know, Noida or Gurgaon responded back. And within a day, people stranded there, got their ration. In Delhi, the government reaction was very bad, pathetic actually. People are basically on charity. Pathetic government reactions. They are, you know, they are all on charity. And the way governments are, you know, reacting to bring people back to their home, that is also, you know, a fundamental violation to, you know, Article 14 of the Constitution of India, which says right to equality. And many states are facilitating students who are stranded in places like Kota or in other state, you know, sending buses and all, but the similar facilities are not given to the migrant laborers. So there is a clear violation of Article 14 of the Constitution of India. So basically, overall, this is what they are going through. And I would just like to mention particularly about Guwahati. I have seen there are a large number of women who are stranded here. When we tried to provide them with rations, you know, most of the women, they came out. And whenever you go out, it is mostly the women who comes out to buy certain things or to collect rations. The most important problem apart from the rations are the house rent. Many landlords have waived off, or they are not asking for house rent. But in our backyards, I have seen, you know, recently when the government tried to send people to their home, in our backyard, they were not allowed to go because the tenants who were the migrant laborers, they were not able to pay the rent. This is actually the violation of government directives, because you cannot ask for rent right now. That is what the government have said, but that is not being followed overall. If these people go and approach police might take some action, but on the ground, people are suffering not only for rations, but also they are being harassed by their landlords to pay their rent. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Aman, for ending on that sort of very realistic note, and sort of it brings back home to us all some of the key issues that people are facing right now. So we have about 20 minutes for a question and answer session now. So I thought what I would do is we've had some questions in from participants earlier, and I thought that I'd kick off a question that would perhaps help us to break down the category of migrants, something that Gautam had raised. You know, we've had examples of people who've traveled out of their countries to work. We've got examples of people who've traveled sort of within states, and the inter and intra-migration divide. But I thought, thinking about the language of rights and human rights that we've been talking about, we've also been talking about the business and economics of it. But what about the voices of the workers? What sort of language are they using to express their rights? And are we listening to what they have to say, particularly in the context of COVID? And perhaps linked to that, why is it important for all of us to be having this regional discussion right now at this point? So I wonder if anyone wanted to pick up on those points. Haris, go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mariam. I think what Gautam said and what the rest of us here have also shared, and rightly so, that workers, I mean, in the last 15, 20 years, we have seen of workers across the region, across the world, in fact, but more so in our region. And there is also this
Oh, I think we're losing you a bit on the connection. Do you mind just
repeating? Yeah, sure. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. No, I was just saying very quickly, I was saying that, you know, workers as a category across the world, and particularly in our region, you know, they're becoming, like Gautam was saying, I like something that he said, that, you know, they're very visible and they are completely invisible. I mean, and so, because one major issue that they face is there is no collective bargaining available to them through their trade unions, and so workers are not organized the way they used to be organized, you know, a few decades ago. So there is a serious issue that they face. I mean, all of our you know, private sector industries, and even now the state enterprises in some cases are you know, banning trade unions or sort of discouraging trade unions, and that is something that we need to look at. On other, you know, and I think we need to have a movement. I mean, if they can't, you can't have a labor rights movement, and a labor rights movements cannot actually, I mean, there has to be a regional labor rights movement also that we need to look into, and it is not an impossibility.
No, I think this point of having a regional labor rights movement, we've had a couple of questions.
The possibility now also. Yes, and the other, you know, I'm saying it is not an impossibility to have a regional effort that looks at unionization of labor and their voices being better heard through their collective bargaining and through their networks and through their solidarity. Want to flag so that we do not overlook is the tension that exists among India and Pakistan particularly, but also between India and other countries in the region at a smaller scale. You know, just imagine if all these countries which are providing you know, tens of millions of labor across the world could come together and have a joint voice in you know, speaking to countries like Saudi Arabia, which are famous for their human rights record, and similar countries where our labor works. So it would have been a very different response. I mean, they would deal with it very differently if there's a joint understanding, and also the possibility of people working within the region. So we have closed that opportunity for people working within the region, and that you know, I mean, the amount of money that we spend on defense, and so that goes beyond the scope of conversation today, but that really is an issue which we must not forget. And finally, and very quickly, in migrants, I think the bigger issue that we face is of in-migrants, because 4 of our major cities in Pakistan, Karachi, which has the highest number of in-migrants, and followed by Multan, Lahore, and Rawalpindi, Islamabad. Their day population of Multan, Lahore, and Rawalpindi, Islamabad, the day population is about 70% more than the night population. So it's major, and most of these people are either stranded because there is no transportation available to them, or and so they are living on food rations. And essentially, people who have not been able to migrate, like from Karachi, I mean, most of the migrant labor are still there because they have very poor living conditions, but they still live there. So they are also living on food rations, and they will be unemployed. If they are not unemployed as yet, they will soon be unemployed, because, as I said, that even before COVID, our industries were shutting down, and there was a major economic crisis that we were facing. So I think in-migrants are also a major category that we should be concerned about, besides the migrant workers that we are concerned with.
Thanks, Haris. I don't know if any of you have anything to add to that, but we have had a couple of, Mustafa, I'll just turn to you actually. I was going to ask you to add to that from your context, but we've had a couple of questions in about the inefficacy of SAARC and ASEAN and other sort of regional bodies. Go ahead, Mustafa.
Yeah, and I'm also mindful of time, so I'll be very quick, because I think Haris really covered so many points so eloquently. But just to say, yeah, a great point about union participation and collective bargaining and collective action. And in terms of the question of what are workers' voices and perspectives, I think that's really key. But as we're seeing generally with the deficit in democracy globally and in South Asia, it's not just enough to give people a voice. You have to also empower them with the wisdom of what their rights are. And I don't mean that in any patronizing way, because of course we have a lot to learn from people who are in these marginalized situations. And in fact, they're usually the ones leading more than we are. So I'm not ignoring that at all. But just to say that in our experience, at least, when we speak to workers, typically what they're talking about is survival. So even in a very bad situation, they're talking about, I want more money. I want to work as many hours as I can. When is the lockdown going to end? They are not thinking of it from a human rights perspective, because it's not relevant to them. It's not made relevant to them. When you try to unionize workers, make them collectively organize, bring them together, educate them, that even within countries like South Asia and even in the Gulf, there are some basic protections under their own laws that are meant to apply to them. That is something that's really key. So I think that's something that we have to really to work on. And what we've found is, in virtually every part of South Asia, there are already grassroots worker groups, whether they're internal migrants, who are actually most migrant workers, or the ones who go overseas. So thinking about ways, how do we help those organizations to really be more organized and use a rights-based framework? I think that's a really key thing.
That's really, really helpful. And in fact, what we're going to try and do is, after this discussion, is sort of collect ideas from you as panelists to see how we can move forward sort of in terms of a collective regional question and movement. But we've had a couple of specific questions in to different participants. So I'm going to start with one, a question to Barun from Om at the Advocacy Forum regarding about 250 migrant workers who were forcefully returned to Nepal by the Qatar government. What did civil society manage to do for them, and how did the Nepali government respond to that? I'll then follow up with a question for Gautam, which is coming specifically for him. There is a whole host of questions, and I do apologize that we're not going to be able to address them all. So, Barun, over to you.
Particularly with there was termination of job, and they were sent back to Nepal. There has been civil society organization came together, and they came up with a collective voice on what was being done. Amnesty International picked up on it, and then did a statement release. But the thing is, more than that, I'd like to cite a very recent example and relate it to the language of right that you earlier mentioned. So for instance, 2 weeks back, Supreme Court of Nepal gave an interim order to government to take necessary measures and create a mechanism by which they can bring back the workers home. And after a week, minister responsible, the line minister, said that they cannot do that in the meantime. So the question is, the legal commitment is in one hand, human rights commitment is in other hand, but both cannot be translated in practice unless government comes up with a concrete plan of action. So in case of Nepal, society organization has been very vibrant. They've been very active. They've lost public interest litigation. There's even workers have organized themselves. So there is a momentum from this side. But on part of the government, they look pretty much like out of clue on what they should be doing and what statement they should come out with, because there's differences on like government's approach, like how they're dealing with it. So the thing is, like with language of rights, civil society and judiciary is in one tone, government is in different level. So there's like no toning between them. And we've also seen like inflation of language of rights, because it's questionable, because if a Supreme Court of the country decides that there should be right to return and government should work on it and nothing happens, then people would question like, how is it going to work or what's going to happen from here? So it's a very dire situation in that regard.
Thanks, Barun. And actually, in line with the question on government responses, Gautam, we have a question in for you about what do you think governments from different states can do in terms of the initiatives that they're taking to receive their laborers? And they've given the example of what's happening in West Bengal, which hasn't made any decision to date. So do you have anything to say about that?
I think a lot of it is very contextual in terms of the conditions to which states are going back. I think at this point, everyone is grappling with trying to get to an agreement on what the terms of transport will be. And we've seen a huge set of vacillation on first paid programs, then free programs, then buses, then trains. And now this morning, there's a very disturbing piece of news from the government of Karnataka that I would wait for confirmation from the government, but there seems to be a argument that the government is going to stop the trains that they had announced for migrant workers following a meeting with the Professional Association of Construction Builders. And this would be a very, very serious constitutional violation, actually, in many ways, to sort of, argue that workers could not exercise their choice whether to stay or go, simply in order for industry to have labor. And I think this example typifies the point, right? States need to be thinking in terms of incentives that make a worker want to stay and therefore work in industry, not closing their borders and then saying, you're staying because I have not given you any way to leave. There's no other word for that than bondage. And it's not, and I'm not trying to be dramatic about it, but if you tell me I can't leave because you won't make a train or transport available to me, so I'm forced to work for a set of people without then the social protection around it, there is no other word for that other than bondage. So I think there's a very disturbing sense here. And I can empathize a lot with governments who find themselves making very, very difficult trade-offs, being asked to both restart economies as well as prevent epidemic infection. But they have to realize that workers are making precisely that choice that they are being forced to make. And so if anything, we should be able to understand that we have to enable workers to make choices. On the receiving end, I think the state I would look at a little bit closely, and again, I haven't had a chance to look at this in detail because everything's happening so fast. I would look at Jharkhand among the states that we have seen, at least in India, where the language of return I'm not bringing up Kerala right now very specifically because I think that's a known case, but I would look at the way the language that Jharkhand is using. It was the first state to negotiate with other states even before the central nod had been given. The receiving infrastructure is widely publicized. There is a note of welcome. And I think the reason the chief minister is being so proactive in the media and so careful about the language he uses about these returns is he's anticipating prejudice. He's anticipating fear. He's anticipating a lot of workers are going to be received with a lot of suspicion. I have colleagues who work in rural development who are reporting that every day in villages across India, 3 or 4 people finish that long walk from the highway and show up. And in many places, they're not being received, like Arpeeta was saying, they're not being received simply. There's a very complex reception at the other end. There's a lot of fear. And that means that actually one of the things about, it's not just a question of let them go home or not go home. There I'm very clear. You have to enable the structures of choice that allow migrant workers to either remain or leave. It is not about seeing what they do. It's about maximizing that to make a meaningful choice. Telling them to stay because you force them to stay is not a choice. And so if you think about that, and the other end, we have to think about that center of reception. I think that, this is the basic set of, if our approach to this begins, then I think the technical questions of health quarantines, information, Arpeeta talked about the nature of information that is given, building up infrastructures of reception and screening, that actually, I think that people will know what to do. The question is, you have to decide that people are worth doing it for. And if we're only going to think about getting migrant workers on a train and then simply say, one state saying my problem is done, the other state saying, okay, I brought you home, and then saying, but now you're on your own, that's not going to work. So I think we really have to think about structures that enable meaningful choices that help people cope with a situation that is not of their making. And I think, if the Karnataka news is true about the trains being stopped because of a meeting with employers, that is a very disturbing sign that approach and attitude is simply not in the right place. And beyond that, there's no point discussing what one should do because they intend to do it. In Hindi, we have this sense saying, "Niti ke pehle niyat zaruri hai." Before policy, you need intention. And so we have to talk about the intention.
Thank you, Gautam. That's so helpful. And we have a couple of minutes left. And actually taking that idea of intention, we're all coming to this issue from, again, different jurisdictions, different civil society platforms. How are we going to, in your work, rather, I'm posing this question to you, is in your work, how are you going to use this COVID moment? I mean, we've all agreed that, the issues that the workers that we're supporting have been here the whole time. COVID has only enhanced those and brought those issues into relief. But what are we going to be doing during this time to develop our own work, influence policy, and sort of take the next steps, as it were? I don't know if any of you want to sort of engage with that in the last couple of minutes. Arpeeta. You're still on mute.
Can you unmute me? Sorry, can you hear now? Yeah, thank you. So Mariam, just to very quickly talk about it, because I am in the academia and I have been doing a lot of street law and community level lawyering for a good amount of time. What we believe, from a group of peers in Bangladesh, that, it is high time that most South Asian countries, and this does not apply to Nepal, most South Asian countries should now have a shift of focus to understanding that economic, social, and cultural rights are paramount. There has to be a shift of focus, and we have to spend budget on making education and health applicable and accessible to all the people. So suddenly we have this situation, and the government has to come up with a bailout package amounting to hundreds of millions of US dollar in Bangladesh. So if we have to do it in an emergency situation, then it means there are avenues to explore how to do it in a normal situation, spend more on making people aware. Why does it happen in Bangladesh that, whenever we have to talk about hygiene situation, quarantine situation, or simply following instructions, people don't get it? And then we go on and blame the people. But have we ensured an educational system where people are trained to follow instructions in a scientific manner? Do we train students to apply their analytical ability? No, we just focus on rote memory. And then the government goes, or the civil society goes and says that, the Bangladeshi people are going to kill themselves. No, you just cannot shift the blame to the people completely. Neither can you shift the blame on the government completely, because it is the people who constitute the government. The government just doesn't come out of the thin air. So unless we focus on economic, social, and cultural rights, we will be suffering in terms of civil and political rights. Migrant workers will not have democratic voices. The other, the bargaining associations, they will not have any voice, because it has to be the workers themselves who have to talk. No INGO, no NGO, no ministry can come and speak for them. And that is what has been happening for the last, 50 or 60 years in South Asia. Other organizations are speaking on behalf of communities. And so these are just masks. This is not how it happens. So unless we take this lesson from Corona, that we will be focusing on health, we will be focusing on education, we will be focusing on other socioeconomic and cultural rights, because identity is important when it comes to culture. Unless I value your identity, no one will be talking about it. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And actually, I've had a whole host of Bangladeshi participants giving thumbs up to you, Arpeeta. Mustafa, just a last comment for you. We're a little tight on time, but I'd really like you to add your comment to this. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. And just a really small comment, and it's in no way to say it responds to the question you asked in every respect, but I think one very practical, immediate thing is we know millions of workers have returned to South Asia and have not been paid money that was owed to them. This is separate to they're losing their job. This is something that hits all South Asian workers, regardless of what nationality. Surely we have to put more pressure on the governments to say, whether you're India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, any other country, that they're all in the same boat. They should be lobbying the destination countries, particularly in the Gulf, where most of the workers are, to say, we know what's happening. We're going to record every single worker, put out information for workers to lodge a complaint about their lost earnings and benefits, and then take that up with the Gulf governments. I stress that alone is not this panacea. There are many other things to talk about too, but I think that's one very practical thing that is across the board happening to all workers, and these governments should be coming together, and that's what we should collectively, one thing among others, that we should be pushing for.
Great, thank you, Mustafa. That's so helpful. And actually moderating this panel, I mean, I knew before we started that 1 hour was certainly not going to be enough. And I realized that even more as the discussion has progressed. So I want to thank everybody on the panel for joining us and just adding so much fascinating information, but also giving us a sort of pathway to the next steps that we should be taking. I want to thank the audience. People have joined us from across South Asia, from the UK, from Singapore, from the Philippines. So thank you so much. I did tell Barun that I wanted to give him about a minute before we ended to talk a little bit about the regional platform that he's creating for iProbono. So Barun, I'm literally going to give you a minute. And before I sort of say bye to you all, please do get in touch with us at iProbono. Let us know what you thought of the discussion, and also let us know what we should talk about next on this migrant rights platform. We'd be really interested to hear from you. Thank you. Barun, over to you. Final words. Thank you.
Yeah, so from the discussion, that it's very clear that migrant workers issue is a South Asian issue.
We can't quite hear you. Sorry.
Can you hear me now? Okay, so migrant workers issue is a cross-regional issue for South Asia. So one of the very essential first step is collective engagement. Collective engagement of workers, collective engagement of civil society, and collective initiation of lawyers and legal professionals working in this area is of paramount importance. And we also need to focus on migrant diplomacy collectively in line with human rights discussion that is taking shape now. So I think it's very necessary for us now to think of regional through which we can proceed with the collective interest and protect the rights of migrant workers, working together with them. So we're creating a panel of regional lawyers and civil societies working in this area to work further in this regard, not only in regard of pandemic, but in macro level to make it better for migrant workers and their families.
Thank you, Barun, and I hope you'll all be part of that journey with us as well. So thanks all for joining us. And on that note, I'm going to end the conversation. Thank you.